Muhami Matters with Chris Adams, powered by CJA Consulting.
Hello, welcome to Muhami Matters, where credibility meets clarity in legal and professional services. I'm your host, Chris Adams, founder of Muhami and CJA Consulting. In professional services, technical competence is expected, but competence alone doesn't build influence, deepen client trust, or really elevate professionals into true trusted advisors. In today's episode, we're going to explore the psychology behind growth and also behind executive presence and high performance, and why some ambitious professionals plateau while others continue to rise. I'm joined by Reid, organisational psychologist and leadership consultant who works with senior lawyers, executives, and professional services leaders all over the world to help them move from capable onto exceptional. Today's conversation is going to be about influence, ego, identity, trust, and what really differentiates those who lead from those who simply perform. Richard, welcome. Nice to have you today. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Chris.
For those who are not really familiar with your work, can you just briefly introduce yourself and explain what you do?
Yeah, so I'm a psychologist originally by background, working with people all the way from severe trauma all the way through to some of the things that you've just alluded to around high performance. So that's working with individuals, working with teams, working with organisations. But essentially everything I do is about helping people to be the best version of themselves.
Why do high-performing professionals generally seek you out?
It's often people who are doing very well, so they're high functioning, but they have a strong sense that they could be doing better. And what you often find is when you get to a certain level within any field, you're often competing with people that are at an equal level to you. So it's about differentiation. How is it in terms of performance, in terms of connection, that you can gain that advantage in your field? So that's a lot of the work that I do with the high performers.
Okay, and you mentioned trauma as part of your introduction. Is that something that a lot of the high-performing professionals have as part of their, their experience? Is there a common denominator there?
Well, it's an interesting question. So primarily it's with people who've been involved in extraordinary circumstances. So I've done a lot of work with Transport for London in the UK, who govern all the trains and the buses. Done a lot of work with the police and the MOD around trauma. So it's those sort of obvious circumstances of trauma. But with high performers, it's not always the case, but sometimes it can be. It could be the case that actually you've had a bad experience. So, for example, you've given a presentation that hasn't gone, or even something elsewhere in your life that in some way is forming some kind of mental block for you that keeps coming up, even though perhaps there are lots of examples of where you've done things well. So in some circumstances, not most circumstances, but some circumstances, it can be about trying to unlock that trauma to help people to achieve everything that they can.
Okay, so I guess many people associate psychology with some kind of trauma or crisis or something like that. How do you distinguish therapy from performance psychology?
Yeah, so even in this day and age, a lot of people have stigmas that they attach to the idea of psychology, and they think it's just for people who've got severe mental health issues, and obviously it can be. But from my perspective, it's really for anybody who wants to use their brain as efficiently and as effectively as possible. It's about learning some very practical tools to enable you to do that. So, people often have this sort of archetypal view of psychology where you lie on a sofa for 10 years and talk about how awful your father was. And maybe you get lots of insight, but actually you don't get anything practical that enhances how you perform in your everyday life. And that's not where I sort of come into this at all. It's really about where are you now? Where do you want to get to? What are the most practical, low-cost ways that you can get there? And by low cost, I mean, what are the ways that are not suddenly going to become a second career in their own right? What are the things that you start to use just to tweak the way that you engage with your everyday experience?
Okay, so it's basically taking what you're doing every day and just building on that a little bit rather than completely changing the world or changing the way you work or go about life.
Absolutely. And all of us, we've got tried and trusted ways of doing things. And we might know that there are potentially better ways of doing things, but it can be quite scary at letting go of those things. And it's also a big ask when you live a busy life, isn't it? To say, well, look, put all of those things on hold and try something completely new. So what I try to do when I'm working with people is to show them small tweaks. So it's sort of maximum bang for your buck in effect. So actually small things you can do that have a maximum impact for you. And it's those sort of small incremental changes in most situations that are all that people need.
So as we've mentioned, the people you work with are generally very ambitious. What does that look like psychologically?
So that ambition, it's an interesting question. That ambition often spurs them on to bigger and better things. But the risk with that is that sometimes there may be mental blocks. There may be circumstances that are outside of your immediate control. And in essence, often what happens is the mental dialogue that you've used to talk to yourself to get you to a certain position in life may then start to work against you. And what you often find is that people who are very ambitious and high performers, they talk to themselves in quite a self-critical way. And that can spur you on, but it can also turn in on you when there are things that you can't do anything about, or things that actually have happened because of lack of insight or lack of experience in those areas. So some of it is dealing with that. Some of it's about taking your ego out of the situation. And inevitably, we like to be seen in a good light. We want to do things to the best of our ability, but sometimes that doesn't happen. And often it's the ego that then gets in the way and prevents us from actually learning from those experiences. It's very, very common that we then shy away from those experiences, or we engage with them almost through gritted teeth. And so it's really important. This is one of the things that I look at with people, how it is that you apply yourself to situations where you do have those setbacks or failures. How can you use those to inform what you do so you don't plateau, you don't retreat?
So is it a little bit about building resilience in them? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, a lot of people think resilience is purely about gritting your teeth and getting through situations. And that is one form of resilience. But the bigger part of resilience is really about using any kind of situation as a form of feedback. And you think about any of us, there have been situations that we've encountered in life, many which we wouldn't have chosen, but actually weeks, months, years later, we might reflect on and think, I can see how that has positively informed how I now work, or I can see how that has taken me in a different direction or given me a different perspective. And when we can start to fast track that process, in other words, apply what we call the growth mindset, then we can make those changes much quicker and with less anxiety and pain attached to them. But so often when we have these sort of setbacks and failures, we think, how does that make me look? What do I need to do to avoid feeling like that again? And often that comes at things from the perspective of actually retreating, not trying things again, rather than engaging with them and refining. And it's those small refinements that make the biggest difference. We can actually learn the most from failure and setbacks, even if none of us want to naturally encounter setbacks and failure.
Yeah, so it sounds a little bit like self-limiting beliefs from some kind of negative experience or some kind of blow to the confidence has happened, and then you think, I don't want to revisit that again, even if it's subconsciously, I guess, sometimes.
Absolutely. You can kind of understand that to some degree, because why do we want to encounter things that have been uncomfortable or difficult? The brain naturally gravitates towards safety and comfort. Understandably, comfort and safety doesn't necessarily propel you to those next levels in terms of your career or indeed other aspects of your life. So we have to lean into discomfort. But the important thing is that we do that in a very measured way. And it's what we call, in effect, graded exposure, if we're talking about it in therapy terms. It's how do I lean into this in a way that doesn't feel completely overwhelming, gives me opportunities to reflect and refine without experiencing what we call flooding. Flooding is when you dive in at the deep end. Sometimes that can work for you, but so often that, we talk about trauma, that so often that can be traumatic that people double down on the fact they absolutely don't want to do that ever again. And you see this in lots of different areas, but I guess a classic example would be something like giving public presentations. Those are areas that a lot of people naturally find difficult, and a lot of people have had difficult experiences with those. Even very, very senior, very accomplished people often try and avoid those situations, and that then puts even more weight behind those experiences when we do have to engage with them, or there's the potential that we have to engage with those kind of experiences.
That's quite interesting. Yeah, a lot of the people that I work with, all the people who listen to this podcast are lawyers or other professionals, and they don't like to be wrong. They don't. I think that's why sometimes they get that fear of speaking in front of people, because they like to be right. They don't want to be wrong, and they put a lot of their own self-belief, I guess, based on credibility, sometimes misplaced.
Yeah.
So I can understand that. What does it look like? I guess what does plateau that you alluded to look like in lawyers and consultants and similar?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you make because a lot of kind of people who will probably listen to this, they're paid for their expertise, aren't they?
Mm.
Probably disconcerting for a client if you're saying I don't know or I'm not sure. But I think that the risk comes when we are so blindly attached to the idea of being right that we don't ever question our decisions. So yes, we want to be giving reassurance to clients, letting them know that we're the expert in our field and that we're competent and all of those good things. But it's also about, in terms of personal development, how we question and challenge ourselves. And it is about leaning into those areas of uncertainty. And the more that we lean into those, the brain starts to develop an appetite for uncertainty in other areas as well. And it's stepping into that uncertainty, whether that's in your personal life, whether that's in a new or emerging aspect of your job, that gives you that cutting edge. And that's really, really important. You think about, for example, the legal sector, how competitive that is. And, there are lots of individuals, there are lots of organizations all offering very, very similar services. And so you need to have these differentiations as an individual, but also as an organization to be able to stand out and be more competitive. So developing this sort of growth edge is really, really important.
So it sounds a little bit like you don't want competence to be the enemy of exceptional performance. Is this what happens?
Absolutely. The reality in life is that there aren't that many things that are certain. We like to convince ourselves that everything is certain because it makes us feel safer. It gives us a false sense of safety. And yes, we need to be competent and we need to know certain things in order to be able to do our jobs well. But inevitably, there will be grey areas. There'll be grey areas in the law. There'll be grey areas in terms of a specific situation that we're dealing with. But also in terms of our personal development, we need to move away from this idea of things either being right or being wrong. And it's really important, particularly in the realms of personal development, career development, that we see things as more of a process. So yes, great if I get things right first time, but actually whatever the outcome of a situation, look at it as part of an ongoing process. So learning is not something that finishes when you leave law school. It's something that should be going on naturally throughout your life, irrespective of whether you're undertaking formal training or not. So reflecting on things is important. Reflect on things when we've done them well as well, because when we've done things well, we often say, great, job done, on to the next thing. And when we don't reflect on those things and we don't give them due consideration, number one, it's more difficult to replicate that success because we're not thinking about what contributed to that. And sometimes it can give us a false sense of our own capability. It might just be that actually we were lucky and there are still things that we need to improve. But also in terms of resilience, it means that we're not getting the sustenance from those experiences. We're not getting the chance to say, well, look, actually I do do a lot of things pretty well. I am very competent. And what that then means is that we get a disproportionate view of situations when we do have a setback or a failure. So we need that balance. And this is something you often see with high achievers, is that they are acutely aware of where they feel they've failed or let themselves down. They're acutely aware of what the next target is, but actually they're not really fully registering or engaging with the successes. And that means that you don't have this sort of sense of your back catalogue of success when that failure comes in. So again, you're more likely to flounder. So we need that balance and we need that reflective practice. And again, in most walks of life, but legal sector is a prime example. I'm talking to somebody who used to work in the law practice. Time is at a premium, isn't it? Actually, we're very, very busy, and it's very much an emphasis on doing things rather than taking time to reflect. And I'd encourage anybody listening to this, even if your day is packed from one end of the day to the other, even just taking 15 minutes out of your day to take stock can make a profound difference to how you then engage with things, and the level of performance that you are then able to achieve. So even just 15 minutes out of your day to reflect on successes and learning opportunities can be really, really helpful.
It's a really good tip. Yeah, I was going to ask you, how do you address these self-limiting beliefs and the desire for everything to be black and white in practice? How do you address it? So reflection on successes is something very important. I don't do that enough for myself, let alone a lot of people I know. So that makes sense. What else do you do? Do you tell people?
Well, I think some of it is about rehearsal. We are all hardwired to varying degrees to think negatively, and I think a lot of a lot of industries, and law is one of those. It's about mitigating against risks. So inevitably, it's primed to focus more on negatives. So we have to work harder to recognise positives. But also in terms of that idea of the growth mindset, reflecting on setbacks and failures and seeing them as part of a process, that's something we also need to work at. So this is why we need to rehearse these things in order to create new neural pathways that make those behaviors and those attitudes more natural. So this is about making it a daily practice. And even if it's just 15 minutes at the start or the end, or preferably both, top and tail of the day, it starts to ingrain this kind of behavior. And if we know that we've got these sort of designated activities during the day, it will naturally follow that we start to recognize things in real time as they happen and to apply that methodology to them, because we know we've got to do this exercise at the start of the day or the end of the day. So rehearsal is part of it. I also think as organizations or leaders or people of influence within organizations, it's really important to start to normalize this as a way of thinking. And so often in lots of walks of life, and law is a classic example, people are very quick to close people down when they've made a mistake. And I'm not saying accept failures or misunderstandings, but there are ways and means of engaging with those that make people more open to the feedback, that make people less ashamed of having made a mistake, and make them more open to trying things in a different way next time. So how we engage with people when we have a difference of opinion, how we engage with people when there have been mistakes is really important. And again, as a leader or somebody senior within an organization, sometimes acknowledging our own fallibilities, acknowledging our own uncertainty, as long as we're not doing it all the time, is a good way of normalizing that experience for other people, because it's a reality. It's there whether you acknowledge it or not. And if we say, well, actually, I'm not sure, what do you think about this? Or I've got a few thoughts, but I'm really interested to hear what you think. Or I've been really grappling with this. I'm interested to think what other people think. All of these things show other people that we're an authentic human being. And as a consequence, people are more likely to speak up when they don't understand, when they've made a mistake. So you start to create a new type of language and interaction within organizations that means that organizations learn quicker. They move on quicker. It's not about scapegoating. It's about taking the lessons away from situations. So this is a great way of maintaining and developing, accelerating that growth edge. It's also a great way of integrating people in the organization far more effectively. So if people are from a ethnic minority, if people are more junior within the organization, if they are introverts, when we start to incorporate them within the conversations rather than waiting for people to offer input, then people start to feel safer. And when people feel safe, they are more likely to embrace misunderstandings, setbacks, failures in a way which is healthy and productive. You look at some of the big tech giants. So Microsoft is a prime example. They have an attitude where they encourage people to introduce an aspect of playfulness to the work that they do. Yes, the work needs to be done, and it preferably to the highest standard. But actually, when there's a degree of playfulness to it, that involves sometimes accepting that the first thing we try doesn't necessarily work, but we take something away from it. So Microsoft have this attitude that as long as you don't break the company, we don't mind if in small, isolated pockets you experiment with different ways of doing things.
What other companies, since thinking about some of the clients you've worked with, what kind of background have they come from, and how have you helped them, I suppose? What problems do they come to you with, and what have you helped them with?
So a lot of it is around performance and engagement and retention of staff, and it's generally those kinds of things. And a lot of that comes down again to this idea of organizational culture. So what a lot of you go on a company's website and they'll have sort of their mission statement and all of those sorts of things, and all these sort of values that they adhere to. But it's often the case that there is a mismatch between what organizations profess and what you speak in, what you experience in terms of the unspoken aspects of the culture. So a lot of the work is dealing with that sort of cultural element. When organisations tend to make cultural changes or try to, it tends to, the ideas are generally developed at the senior level, but they're generally implemented and acted on from sort of middle management downwards. And the risk with that is that you often get sort of conflicting messages within an organisation that actually we need to create a psychologically safe environment, but actually senior management are too busy doing other things to engage with that training, to demonstrate those behaviours. Part of this is about the level of contact that we have with people. So great when we're with somebody in their appraisal and we're trying to create a safe environment and we're trying to encourage a two-way conversation. But actually, if you don't see your manager from day to day, and a lot of your conversations are very transactional, have you done this? Where is this? Then actually that's not building rapport. That's not building the safety that allows people to speak up when they've got a problem or they've made a mistake. And so it develops shame. Going back to this idea of ego, we have shame when we feel we've made a mistake or we've let ourselves down. And yes, when we make a mistake, we need to try and minimize that and learn from it. But when it's buried, mistakes often become bigger than they need to be, and the learning is not shared, and people don't get the validation that actually we will support you. So very, very common at senior level for people to say we want an open culture, we want psychological safety. My door's always open if somebody's got a problem. But in reality, why would you go to somebody very senior to talk about a problem when you have no interaction with them from day to day?
Yeah, I've been in organisations where that senior person is scary. Basically, they're the one who sits upstairs in the highest level, and you never really see them. You might see them at the firm events making an appearance, but they're not approachable. You don't have that human relationship with them.
Absolutely, and they might be a very nice person, but you don't know. It could feel a bit like going to the headmaster's office, can't it? So it's not always about having big sit-down conversations with people. It can be just sort of having various touch points of little but often. How are you doing? How's your son getting on with his exams? Remembering little things about people that let them know they're seen and they're heard. Even that gives people more encouragement to speak up. We're talking, I guess we're talking primarily about performance of individuals and performance of organisations, but this equally applies to things like mental health. How many organisations have various resources available to support people with their mental health and well-being, but people are wary about using them because of how they're going to be judged or how they perceive they're going to be judged. And again, this comes back to this idea of psychological safety and the fear of in any way showing fallibility.
True. And so you work a lot with individuals at a very senior level, but also I think teams, heads of departments, C-suite, that sort of thing. And you mentioned earlier, it struck me as a very fine line to tread of showing fallibility, showing that, you are a human, you can make mistakes, and asking for other people's opinions versus having to be a leader and be seen as not too, I guess, wishy-washy, or people need to have confidence in you. So you don't want people's confidence to fall away, but you also need to be human. So how do you balance that?
So I think it's important that we all need to have some kind of behavioural filter within the workplace. And the extent to which we apply that will partly depend upon who we are as an individual, but also the prevailing culture within the organisation. So I'm not suggesting that you would start telling somebody anything and everything about you. It needs to be relevant to the particular circumstances or conversation. So oversharing is never a good thing. But I think certainly sometimes holding back on our opinion is useful in terms of encouraging other people to fill that space. And it might be that we can still then express a view on what's been shared and to agree with it, to refine it, to disagree with it. But the fact that we're holding back and inviting other people into the conversation is useful. The other thing that can be useful is to talk about issues that we've worked with before. So it might be actually, I had a situation like this and this is what happened and this is what I learned from it and this is how it's informed what I'm doing now. So it's not a case of presenting yourself as a victim and the fact that you're floundering, but it's saying actually, I've encountered this. You're not alone in that. This is what I learned from that experience. So it's presenting the kind of the aftermath of having gone through that rather than, isn't it awful? What can we do? So I think it's important.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's humanizing you as a leader
It is.
But it's showing that you're still the leader. You've learned from it. Now you've moved on and you can now influence others.
Absolutely. So you're still demonstrating a degree of agency. It's not a case of,
Yes.
what can you do? It's life. And I think
Yes.
that's important, that, it's a reality of life. There are setbacks, there are difficulties, there are things that we didn't see coming. And so long as not every conversation entails those things, then hopefully we do enough to demonstrate our competency. But I think certainly acknowledging a fallibility when it is productive to the conversation, in that it makes somebody else feel actually that's okay, or actually here's another way of looking at it based on my own experience, it makes it more real. And I think sometimes even if we say to people, that's okay, what can you learn from it? People can still feel a great deal of shame, because I think actually that's something you wouldn't do as a leader. Well, that's something that's never happened to you, so you're just saying that. So we often read between the lines. So the more authentic we can be, and sometimes having these real life experiences, the more that people buy into what it is that we're saying. And particularly if we're trying to make cultural change, that's really important, because otherwise people just see it as empty words. You're saying this, but this is the reality.
So we reflected there a bit on, I guess, the internal relationships, internal influence and leadership. I think it leads me to thinking, what differentiates a technically strong professional from a trusted advisor? So I guess that's looking both internally, but also more externally as well with clients.
Yeah. So I think it goes without saying you've got to be competent at what you do. But I think you've also got to engage with people as individuals. And again, some of that comes back to psychological safety. So in other words, how authentic do I think you are as an individual? Or is this transactional? Or are you just telling me what you think I want to hear? So again, some of that might be sharing personal feelings about things. It might be sharing personal experiences, as long as they're pertinent to the topic. I think it's also about being reliable as well. So that actually whatever I say to you that I'm going to do, I go away and I do that in a timely fashion within the timeline that I've originally given you. And again, what we're trying to do in terms of building that relationship is also show that we're dynamic, that we have agency, we can make things happen. Sometimes it's the little words that we use that undermine that. So I'm going to try to do that for you. On the face of it, I'm going to try to do that for you. Sounds like a positive thing, but actually there's a degree of ambivalence there, isn't there? I'm going to try. It doesn't mean it's going to happen. Whereas if I say to you, I'm going to go away and talk to Joe Bloggs and I'm going to feed back to you by 2:00. Again, I'm not promising you something that I may not be able to deliver, but it's very clear what I'm going to do and when I'm going to do it. So sometimes even presenting things in that way gives people reassurance. But first and foremost, it's about creating this idea of psychological safety. So being authentic, but also allowing space within the conversation. You think about in any kind of environment, but particularly a busy, fast-paced environment, how often we jump on the first thing that somebody says. Yeah, and that will be most people's experience of day-to-day interactions. Occasionally holding back allows people to reflect on what they've said and maybe share a little bit more of a personal aspect to that, how they feel about it. Or even it might be that we reflect back our sense of how they're feeling about it. So it sounds like you're quite worried about that. Yes, I'm quite worried. And when you start to identify those feelings and you're showing that level of attentiveness, again, people think that you're on their side. You're not just here because I'm paying your wages. You're here because you genuinely care, alongside being competent and effective at what you do. And that starts to build trust. And again, it's creating these multiple touch points where people start to remember us. And so all of that is important, but it also has to be consistent. So if I'm getting a different version of you each time I meet you, that doesn't make me feel safe. It makes me think, what's coming next? So this sort of points to what you were alluding to a moment ago. This internal element. How we manage our emotions. Yeah, because how we manage our internal world then dictates how we manifest in the external world. So if I'm operating under stress, then the chances are, even if the words that come out of my mouth are perfectly fine, the mannerisms that go with it, the pace that I say it at, how quickly I jump in when you say something will be very different to how they are when I'm relaxed. So again, it might be as the client, I can't quite put my finger on it, but I don't feel quite as connected to you this time as I did last time. So how we do this is really important. And when we're stressed, when we're operating at pace, stress doesn't have to be big events. It could be a cumulative effect of lots of little things that are not memorable in themselves. All of these things affect our emotional intelligence. So I don't register the tone of my voice when I'm saying the things that I say. I don't allow the appropriate pause or body language to accompany what I say. I don't pick up on the nuance that sits beneath the words that you say. And most of us would say that we're good listeners, and many of us are, but we tend to focus upon the facts and the content of what people say, and we don't start to register what are the emotions that sit beneath that. Yeah, it's what we call level 3 conversational intelligence. We tend to operate at level 1 and level 2. Level 1 is, this is what I want. Level 2 is, this is what I think. This is my position. Level 3 is, how does that feel? And how can we work together to create an outcome that works for you and for me? So level 3 is more collaborative. And to get into that, as in any effective negotiation, it's about understanding the emotions that sit beneath somebody's overt statements.
How do you get people to that point? How do you train them to get to that level 3? Because I think it's an acquired skill. It's not something that comes naturally to many people.
Absolutely. And I think in its basic form, number one, it's about managing your own internal emotions, and that involves being more self-aware. So again, it's this idea of reflection, pausing. Even if you've only got 30 seconds between Zoom calls, take stock of how you're feeling. Even if you can't reduce that stress, being aware of it allows you to take a different approach to how you engage in that next conversation. I think the other thing to think about is intention. So when we're going into a conversation, particularly when we've got lots of things going on at any given moment, we increasingly start to objectify people. Even if we are a very caring person, even if we really like people, the way the brain operates is that it starts to streamline. So I've got all these things to do. I haven't got time for the niceties. And often that happens at an unconscious level. So what that means is we go into situations, we make assumptions about what people need. We don't create the space for people to express themselves because we're very conscious of time and outcomes. And so we tend to create the outcomes that we assumed were required. Sometimes that
manifest.
Absolutely. And sometimes that is reacting to the immediate demands of the client. The client might be very stressed.
Yes.
And we think, right, okay, I've got to do this. I've got to make that stress go away. So we jump on the first thing they ask us to do. And I say this as a coach and a therapist. So often people come to me presenting a problem. And the risk is that if I get drawn into that emotion, that I then give them something that's ultimately not fit for purpose. So if I want to be a trusted advisor, sometimes it's about managing my emotional response to what they're saying. And it's about slowing that conversation down so we can have a different type of conversation, a conversation that is not only more productive, but very different to the kind of conversations they may have with most other people. Yeah, so it's a differentiator. And then I can understand where you're coming from in what you're asking for. And it might be, I agree with that and say, yep, fine, let's do that. But it might be, so, well, actually, given what you're saying, maybe this is a better approach for you. And so I'm then offering something that is tailored to the individual. So this is really, really important. So when we're having conversations with people, I think it's important, even if we've only got a few seconds, we weren't expecting the call, to set an intention for how we want to be, rather than just turning up. And if we
prepare, okay.
So even if you can't fully prepare, you don't know what the conversation is going to be about, you can set an intention for the atmosphere that you want to create. And whilst
I guess you can also set an atmosphere for a negative as well. If you go into a call with negative perception about what's going to happen and you're on the defensive or whatever already, or the attack, then probably that's going to have a negative outcome no matter what.
Absolutely. And even if the words don't come out of your mouth, your body language and your general demeanor will trigger something for the other person. So you create these realities. Whereas if you decide, right, I want to create an atmosphere where actually we're collaborative, even if it's, a difficult conversation, it's not a guarantee, but you are more likely to achieve that if you've set the intention of achieving that. And you're more likely to recalibrate mid-conversation if you start to notice you're deviating from that.
Sounds like it's a matter of balancing confidence and emotional regulation. So you want to come across as confident, strong, and knowing what you're talking about, but you also need to have that emotional regulation where you're stable and you're listening strategically, I guess, and understanding what people are saying and reading in between the lines at that level 3 level.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, going back to something we touched on very early on in today's conversation, we talked about the idea of sort of therapy and trauma and how does that relate to performance. But in different ways, all of these different scenarios involve emotional regulation. So self-awareness and tools to be able to do something with the emotions that you recognize. So even for high performance, first and foremost, you're a sophisticated animal. You may be a lawyer, but we're all animals. And so those animal instincts get triggered all the time. We're always feeling something. We tend to think that feelings have no place to play in the modern world, in the modern business world. They're there whether you like them or not. So being aware of them gives you more agency to be able to influence things. And how you manage your emotions indirectly influences other people's emotions, because neurons in the brain mirror other people's neurons. And if you are being conscious about how you're managing your neurons, that will have a knock-on effect with other people. So you have different kinds of conversations, deeper conversations.
So is this balance why some professionals struggle to build trust despite possibly being some of the most knowledgeable people out there, having really strong credentials, but they struggle to build that trust? Is it because of what we just discussed?
Yeah, first and foremost, it is, yeah. It's because they are not aware of what they're bringing into situations, so it's lack of self-awareness. And sometimes there's a hesitancy to develop that self-awareness. People don't want to hear things that they don't like, but often, it's to the realms of coaching or 360-degree feedback that, again, you learn. This is how you're coming across. This is how you're perceived. This is what you might need to work on. And so often teams, organizations, individuals shy away from that. So it's leaning into that discomfort to be able to learn from it. But, anybody listening to this, if you observe people who have those kinds of deeper quality relationships with clients or colleagues, look at the kind of things that they do. They often create more space for those conversations, and even things like appraisals. Worst thing in the world is to say, right, I've got 6 people in my team. I'm going to have 6 back-to-back appraisals. When you're doing that, you start to objectify people. It's getting them out the door.
Yeah.
And so that will start to inform how you behave and how people perceive and how much they open up to you. So when you want to have a quality conversation, you've got to create space for it. And that may be more time out of your day than you would like, but it's worth the investment.
Richard, you worked in some big law firms and in your previous professional life, I suppose. But when you just talked then about 360-degree appraisals and reviews, I've worked in quite a number of law firms. I don't think I've ever had a 360-degree review. Other people I know, it's just part of the culture that you have those things. So do you think there is a gap then, perhaps in professional services, law firms, accountants, doctors, perhaps, that doesn't necessarily, enable the best feedback and the best out of the employees and the people who work for the organisation?
Yeah, definitely. And I say this as somebody who used to be a chief people officer for a law firm, so I know about this kind of thing firsthand. I think a lot of organisations either don't think about applying these kind of things, or they do it in a very piecemeal way. And I think, if you're going to do 360-degree feedback, you need to build a culture around that. It can't sit in isolation. So actually, you've got to have a degree of psychological safety, that people don't think this is going to be used as a form of punishment that's held against them. That actually it's going to be used in a constructive way. That everybody's buying into it. That managers are comfortable with having those tricky conversations with people, but also being receptive to feedback from the people they're giving that feedback to. So you've got to build that infrastructure around it for this to land in the right way. And the more you create a culture that is open to feedback, in both ways, from the manager and from the employee, then people are going to be more open about admitting areas where they need to develop. But so often, because people feel these things are going to be held against them, they develop shame around these things. They become very defensive. A good relationship with, or a consistent relationship with, because they don't see them all the time. So all these things need to be in place for this to really land well. But when you've got those things, 360-degree feedback is tremendously important. And you can almost do stakeholder coaching based around it, where you get various sort of cross sections of the organization or even suppliers and clients to feed into that process, knowing that it's going to be used in a.
So tell us a bit about this concept of executive presence. What is executive presence psychologically speaking?
So executive presence is really about how much of yourself you're bringing to interaction. So some of this is about where your focus is, and you think about how often we have conversations where people aren't fully there. They're thinking about the next thing they've got to do. Well, they're not listening to what you're saying because they're already thinking about their response or their next question. All of these things feed into the level of presence that people feel. And when people feel we're not fully there, they're not going to open up about things that are important to them. So this is all really important. I think the other aspects of presence is what we call gravitas. So gravitas is literally means weight, a Latin word for weight, but it's about how much weight people attach to the things that we say and do. And when we are not confident in ourselves, when we are not managing our emotions and we're nervous or we're stressed, we tend to overcompensate. And what that means is we either don't speak up, or we speak up for the sake of speaking up because we feel we need to justify our existence. But what you find is with the people with the most gravitas is that they may not say a lot and they may not do a lot, but when they do, it really counts. Yeah. So they may only say one or two things in the meeting, but everybody stops to listen because they're not somebody who's just trying to fill the space. Yeah, so that's the first aspect of it. But there are a series of behaviours that go with that. So they tend to be more deliberate with how they use their body language. They tend to be more deliberate in terms of how they structure their sentences. So people with gravitas tend to use shorter sentences, and it's almost as if every word in the structure of those sentences is there for a particular reason. So again, it's very obvious what the key points are and what they're making. Whereas for most people, particularly when they're nervous, there tend to be lots of subclauses and sentences ramble on and there's lots of repetition. And all these things dilute the impact of your message and hence your level of presence.
So it sounds a little bit like there's an internal narrative going on in people that you have to control to have the gravitas. So what role does that internal narrative tend to play in how you come across externally to other people?
It's massive. And it's interesting how many senior people have what we call imposter syndrome. So anybody looking at them will say they're really good at what they do. I can understand why they're in that role. They're very competent. They're very persuasive and impressive. But it doesn't necessarily match with what they're feeling inside. And when that doesn't match, when there is that mismatch, often it means that people overcompensate. So they'll do more or say more than they actually need to do because they've already made their point, and then it dilutes the level of gravitas that they have. And there are lots of reasons why people have imposter syndrome. Often it will be because we're making a step up in our career, so we're going into new territory in effect. But more often than not, it is because of our internal relationship with ourselves. So one prime example of that would be where people are very acutely aware of where they've made mistakes or where they could have done better. And they give very little attention to the value that they're bringing or the successes that they have. So you get a disproportionate balance and a disproportionate sense of yourself. That means that you're constantly feeling shameful or you can't relax because you've got to be wary that you're going to get caught out at some point. So again, it all points back to this idea of taking time to reflect on successes, reflect on setbacks and failures, but definitely reflect on successes and also aspects of your character. So not just outcomes, but also how you're moving things forward. What is it about you as an individual that is enabling those things to happen? So you're giving yourself a more balanced view. And again, that then helps to reduce the imposter syndrome, which then potentially has an impact upon what you put out into the world as well. So really, really, really important.
So I'm thinking this must be, a lot of people must come to you at a senior level with this kind of, they wouldn't outwardly say it, but inside they are like, they have the imposter syndrome, and your job is to help them to kind of overcome that. Do you find that senior professionals are sometimes quite resistant to coming to you and talking to you and doing the self-development?
It varies enormously. I think in this day and age that more and more people are switched on to the idea of psychology as a tool of enablement and professional advancement. But there is still, there is still some stigma attached to it, and also pride as well. A lot of people feel they've got to kind of deal with these things on their own, and being in this senior role can be very lonely because everybody's looking to you for the answers, and it can feel inappropriate to go to other people with challenges. And so what often happens is people hold on to all of these things, and unfortunately they only come to see somebody like me when they're really struggling, that the impact of holding on to all of these things over a sustained period is taking too much of a toll. And absolutely, we can do lots of positive things with people at that stage, but it's far easier to do it and a more efficient way of doing it.
Yes, I think you've got to put your ego to the side. Don't let that become a barrier.
Absolutely.
Open up.
Absolutely. So think about the outcomes you want to achieve. And if you want higher achievement and you want to enjoy what you're doing more, then, putting your ego to one side means you are more likely to be able to do that.
So what, in your view, then, is one underestimated leadership behaviour that shapes culture?
So I think that, a lot of people look at sort of KPIs, those sort of business tangibles, and obviously those are important. But I think the biggest thing that is often missing is engagement. People think about remuneration and all of those sorts of things, but actually how we engage with people, how we make people feel valued and seen, is so important. And when even if we're very busy, even if we just start to remember people's names, remember something about them, and attribute a positive outcome to something specific about us, whether it's our effort or our characteristics, then people really hold on to that, and it gives them a real boost, and people will then go above and beyond. And it's when we start to lose sight of that and think that money is enough or perks are enough that people start to hold back a little bit. They won't go above and beyond, and then people will leave. So, you dilute the IP within the organization when people leave because they're not feeling that recognition and they're not feeling their opportunities to grow in a way that is meaningful for them.
All right. So just to finish this off then, because we've had quite an in-depth conversation and you've given a lot of practical tips. If you could give one final piece of advice to ambitious professionals who want to move from competent to exceptional, what would it be?
Well, I must say, putting your pride aside is first and foremost. Forget about where you think you should be, acknowledge where you are, and look at the gap. What is the gap between where you are now and where you want to be? And what is the route that is going to get you there as quickly and efficiently as possible? And quite often, that is things like personal development. But equally, it's just taking that time for self-reflection. If you don't reflect and you only do it when you're in crisis, then actually things will creep up on you. When you're ahead of the curve because you're constantly reflecting on a daily basis, you're more likely to be able to address things at an earlier stage, whether that's as a problem or as an area of personal development.
Yeah, I think that's good, solid advice. And I think that covers the themes that we've spoken about today, where we've talked about trauma and some sort of upset, I guess, that set you off on a path or another, whether it's consciously or subconsciously, self-limiting beliefs, and wanting to achieve perfection and not being able to get around black and white. But I think also seeking psychological safety and making sure other people have psychological safety who work with you. And the other things I guess I took away is put aside your ego and listen to other people is really, really important. Well, Richard, it's really proud and happy to have you on Muhami Matters today. So thank you for joining us. If people want to get in touch with you and hear more, what's the best way?
So you can find me on LinkedIn. So it's Richard-Reid, spelled R-E-I-D, or you can go to my website, which is richard-reid.com.
Perfect. And I know you work, as I said, globally. You're in South Africa at the moment, but you work in the UK, Australia, all over the world, all kinds of hours. So that's the best way for people to find you. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris.
For our audience, that's it for today's episode of Muhami Matters. A massive thanks again to Richard for joining us and sharing so many useful tips and thoughtful insights from everything from the psychology of influence to presence to sustained professional growth. If today's conversation resonated, it may be time to reflect not just on your technical expertise, but really the behaviours and mindset and psychological habits that shape your impact. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe. Please do share it with your network. For more insights and support, visit muhami.ae. connect with me at CJA Consulting. I'm Chris Adams. Until next time, stay informed and stay empowered. Just don't hang up. Thank you for joining us on Muhami Matters. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe and connect with me to stay updated. Join me again soon as we continue to bring you credible insights, practical strategies, and trusted advice to empower your professional journey. I'm Chris Adams. Until next time, stay informed and stay empowered.